Grady Powell, host of Forged in Fire.
Kyle Mann.
I'm Jay Warner Wallace.
Kira Davis.
It's Ben Up.
Hey, this is Dave Baker.
Carrie Pomeroli.
This is Mike Reiner.
This is Ethan Nicole.
This is Leanne Morgan.
It's Graham Parker, the 5th GP, and this is why you should never.
How I got suckered in.
I'm so embarrassed that I'm here.
You're wasting your time. You got better things to do.
Never listen.
Those darling, yummy Reverend and the Reprobate.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Reverend and the Reprobate. My name is Lucas Pickard. I'll be playing a part of the Reverend today. With
we got a good show for you today.
As always, is
we got a good show.
The Hodge twins wannabe. It is the Reprobate Danley Gibson. What's going on, man?
Not a lot.
So is that just something you're doing special for this episode? Or are you just going to start stealing bits?
I've noticed I've started stealing bits inadvertently, just kind of playing along with it. But like I've done Christina Randall. With
You did.
If you're back and you're my babies.
Mm-hmm.
There's a couple others I can't think of off the top of my head, but yeah, Hodge twins today.
Yeah, well there you go.
Dusty Slay was another one. Go ahead and hit the like button, and if you change your mind, if you decide it was a huge mistake, you can always unlike it later. So if you do that now, we'd appreciate it. We've got a great guest on tonight, or today, or whenever you are consuming your podcast content. Look what a good job I'm doing. Stephen Mansfield.
I think you just killed it with look at what a good job I'm doing. You were doing good until you.
I just wanted to make note that I'm doing a very good job.
So we have back on Stephen Mansfield,
who's one of our favorite guests.
Absolutely,
He's one of our first guests.
Yeah, and one of the most gracious guests we've ever had.
Yeah,
because he gives us way too much time. Because we don't deserve having that much of this guy's time.
He continues melting our faces off with some interesting and full truth.
He talks to us now. It's been a year since we've had him on, and so he talks to us now about where he sees Joe Biden's presidency and what year one has looked like for the Biden administration, where he thinks the midterm elections could be going.
Three more years, folks.
Where he
That's all I gotta say.
Where he sees the midterm elections going, what it's like teaching at a university, and where he sees the ideas of moral truth and moral relativism kind of intersect and clash together at the university level, and what he's doing as a university professor to try to combat some of that, but also to continue to raise up young men. And he tells us a little bit about a program that he's trying to start to help bring men's studies as a minor to universities around the country. It's a fascinating interview that touches on a lot of crazy topics. He even tells us how it is that he would fix the Dallas Cowboys as we've experienced yet another playoff heartbreak with Dak spiking the ball right at 0 seconds. It's the wonderful, the fabulous, the talented, the handsome as Reagan and Winston Churchill, senior fellow, Stephen Mansfield. Danley back on our airwaves as we've been talking with him off the air is the new senior fellow of Republic Leadership, which he told us not to say, for Palm Beach University. It is a New York Times bestselling author and a very good friend of the show. It is Dr. Stephen Mansfield. How are you, Doc?
Man, I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me back on.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a ton of stuff that we want to talk to you about, as always.
All right.
But we bring you on because you tend to be the voice of reason in a tumultuous political climate. And as our show typically does not lean very political, we like having you on because you can help us sort through some of the stuff. You talk about things in a way that just it makes a lot of common sense. So that said,
you're like the Jordan Peterson of America.
Yeah, there you go.
I wouldn't mind that a bit.
Me either.
Yeah, so
he's awesome.
So I want to start off with looking at this past year and just seeing like what your feeling tone is. We talked to you right after the elections, right before Joe Biden took the presidency. What's been your feeling tone on the Biden presidency now 1 year into it, almost to the day?
What is feeling tone? Is that like mouth feel for food?
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
Would you guys stop? I'm a patriot. I love my country. I want every administration to be successful at the main core issues, addressing the main issues of America. The Biden administration, as we've all been hearing all week, has just been, and of course, since he came into office, has been really hobbled It's been hobbled by divisions in the Democratic Party. It's been hobbled, I think, I don't mean to be unkind here, by Mr. Biden's age and a little bit of fuzzy thinking. Again, I'm not trying to be engaged in age bigotry here. And he's been dealt with some difficult things. The problem with Joe Biden, I have to say, is that he's never really worked out in the real world. He graduated from law school in '68 and ran for Congress successfully in '70. So he only had 2 years of being, quote unquote, in the real world before he started a political career that hasn't ever ended. Years and years and years in the Senate. So he thinks differently than the rest of us. And it's been a very troubled administration. It's been sad to watch. Our exit from Afghanistan has just horribly hobbled us as a nation. So I pray for him every day. I hope for good things. I'm not with the leftist leanings of his administration, as you can imagine. But there are good people in this administration, and some of them are doing good things. But it's been really hard to watch this first year.
Speaking of the exit in Afghanistan, last time we had spoke, we had discussed. I think it was the last time. Maybe it was one before.
No, yeah,
but
it was. I think I know where you're going with this. We talked a lot about the Kurdish people.
Yeah. So how have you heard from them what their view is on how we handled the exit and any continued lack of support for them?
Well, when America appears weak, it emboldens our enemies and terrifies our friends. And the Kurds are our friends, and they rely on America being strong. Now, as I may have said the last time we were together, Mr. Trump did the Kurds a horrible disservice by restraining American troops from just south of the Turkish border. And so Kurds were killed. Now Kurdistan, northern Iraq, is less safe. The cause of the Kurds was damaged. I had hoped that one of the areas in which Mr. Biden would be better than his predecessor, I didn't agree with him on most of his platform, but one area in which he is experienced and has shown a lot of favor is towards the Kurds. He's made more trips to Iraqi Kurdistan than any other person in the Senate ever. He's knowledgeable. He is on a first name basis with the leaders in Kurdistan. So I had hoped that there would be a real uptick for their experience. The problem is Afghanistan overshadows all that. It emboldens Turkey. It emboldens Russia. It emboldens the Taliban, which means that the radical element within Iraq, especially Iraqi Kurdistan, is emboldened. And Mr. Biden is horribly distracted. He's more about his domestic agenda and more about recovering internationally than he has been about trying to work with the Kurds. So they're not a whole lot worse off, but they're a whole lot more in danger, if that makes sense. It's not as though their actual condition is horribly diminished, but they are certainly more in danger, by the way, as are all of our allies, because we look like a hobbled giant. Witness Ukraine and witness Taiwan, both of which are under threat by their enemies and may very well be taken over in the next year or so.
Wow. So you do think it's a realistic possibility that Taiwan and Ukraine might be invaded?
Well, there's no question that whether it's a head fake or not, I can't say. But Russia right now is setting up what they call in diplomatic circles false flag arrangements. A false flag would be like a country faking an invasion on itself so it can blame it on another country they actually want to invade. So they're setting up those scenarios now. They're setting up border crises in Ukraine. They've got Russian factions within the Ukraine that they are funding and stirring up to oppose the government. Then they can come in and say, we are only coming in to protect an oppressed Russian minority, that kind of thing. It's all artificial. What they want are the natural resources of the Ukraine, the land of Ukraine, and more territory. Putin wants to resurrect the Russian Empire. He thinks that the fall of the Soviet Empire was one of the great tragedies of the 20th century. He said that quote. That's almost an exact quote. So yeah, I do think that Russia, unless there are those who intervene, hopefully a resurgent United States, I do think that Russia is absolutely positioning itself to take over Ukraine. And China is without question wanting Taiwan back. They're flying military routes overhead in violation of policy. They've got ships in the sea. And quite frankly, apart from the U.S. intervention, it could happen in about 7 days. So both of those are threatening right now. And both of those threats have increased since Afghanistan. It may not mean that much to the average American, just living on the streets here. But to our enemies, to those outside of our country, it was hugely symbolic. And like I've said repeatedly, emboldening our enemies and terrifying our friends.
You know, one of the things, as I've been listening back to some of the episodes that are on the Hardcore History podcast that Dan Carlin does, one of the things I find so interesting about the First and Second World War is how insulated the United States was just in general. At the turn of the century, this being in the 19th or the 20th century, the 1900s, we really didn't have much by way of international domestic policy as it related to foreign wars and those kind of things. Well, by the end of the 40s, we've been involved in 2 foreign wars. What's the likelihood that the United States does get involved, and what would that mean, for us on the international stage?
Well, I consider it the providence of God, as a man who believes God is involved in world history and certainly American history, that we are protected by 2 oceans, an ocean on each side. And we have not suffered like other nations have. I think I've told you before that I grew up partially in Germany, my father, a U.S. Army officer, and I was living in Germany 15 years after the end of World War II. Well, we had to vacate a city block once because there was an unexploded U.S. bomb that had stuck in the top of the building that nobody had seen before. This is 15 years later. We couldn't drink. Those of us from the U.S. were told by the Army not to drink water from the spigots. We always had to do special things with water. We had K rations stored in our house, which are like military rations, in case the food supply was disrupted. This was in 1960. So when there has been a war in your land and you have been devastated like Germany was, I mean, it takes forever to recover. It changes mentalities. It damages generations. And we've not had that in the U.S. for the most part. I mean, the most serious attack we've had in our recent national life was Hawaii, which I don't mean to make light of it, but the last time I flew to Hawaii, it took me 11 hours from Atlanta. I mean, that's way out there. So we've not had continental attacks other than terrorist actions. So what I'm trying to say is that I think we're very likely to enter into a war remotely. If Russia goes into the Ukraine, I don't see how the U.S. cannot. That's going to be a war in Eastern Europe. Think about that. We're going to have to get involved. In fact, I think our NATO obligations actually obligate us to get involved. Oh, wow. So we're going to have to get involved. But it's not going to be happening in Dallas. It's not going to be happening where I'm sitting right now in Washington, D.C. It's going to be happening, thousands of miles away. And we'll conduct that war from, military bases that most of us have never even heard of. So we have been wonderfully blessed. Now, I will say that if we continue to signal weakness as a nation, and we don't do anything in the face of an incursion into the Ukraine and an incursion into Taiwan, we will see a continental attack. I believe that we'll see it. We'll see it in my lifetime. So it's a dangerous, dangerous thing. And this has been the pattern all throughout history. When a president shows weakness, our enemies go to work. It happened during the notoriously weak Carter administration. It's happened during other administrations, and it's happening now. And I don't say that gloating. I'm not just dancing on the Democrats' grave, so to speak. I want to see our country be solid and strong and moral and righteous. But right now, we've signaled weakness to the world. The Afghanistan situation still hasn't come to a conclusion. So it's dangerous right now, the world over for the U.S.
If you're Biden, what would you do now to correct, to take corrective measures to send a signal of strength to our friends and our enemies?
Well, he's tried the diplomatic route, and I'm sure he did that skillfully because he's a skillful, kind of politician, statesman guy. But the standard diplomatic response is you start moving forces into the area. You move your aircraft carriers as nearby as you can, because, with our high-speed jets these days, a jet can take off from an aircraft carrier that's 500 miles away and be there in 2 minutes. It's stunning. So that's how you threaten. You start flying your bombers overhead. You start letting the Russians know this is going to be expensive for you. And that's what we should do. I'm sure we are doing it. Obviously, a lot of that stuff's not going to be overt. We don't announce that on the evening news. But we are, I'm sure, moving our forces there. Now, moving aircraft carriers, I've got friends who've commanded aircraft carriers, and they feel like chess pieces sometimes. They're moved here, show teeth. Okay, come over here, show teeth. And sometimes they actually engage. But for the most part, this is diplomatic chess, and that's what's going on right now, and that's what they should do. The main thing should be that the administration should be working with Congress so that if Russia engages, we don't have to have 6 weeks of debate, that the decision's already made. They go, we go. That's got to happen. Biden is the commander in chief, but most Democrat commanders in chiefs don't decide to just engage on their own. Republicans have, Democrats don't tend to. And so that he probably, being a man of the Senate, would ask for a lengthy debate. That would damage our cause.
So you've mentioned a couple of times that there were some things that you didn't agree with on the far left side of the debate. With the midterm elections coming up, the word equity is being thrown around a lot. And this is something that I think that there's a difficult, a difficulty within just common culture to know, like, what's the difference between equity and equality? Why is that term being used so often right now? And is there a difference between equity and equality?
Well, in the matter we're discussing right now, not really. Some people want to make a big deal out of it, but basically, and I'll just go ahead and tell you where I am. Where there's been systemic racism or bigotry, we need to have systemic equity. We need to make sure that all parties are being treated equitably. But that's not the same thing as assuring equality of outcomes. That's not assuring that everybody who enters the college is going to graduate from the college. We can't assure that. We don't know what their academic abilities are beyond a certain level. So I do believe that there's a need for an equity upgrade in America now. We've had some systems that are bigoted. We've had some systems that are biased. The majority sets the temperature in the room on the thermostat to its comfort. And one of the things I like about what's happened today is that others are starting to say, you know what, this is not comfortable for us. This is not serving us well. You got to take us into consideration. And I think that's a good thing. If there's bigotry in the military, if there's bigotry in Congress, if there's bigotry in admissions, if there's bigotry in federal spending in certain neighborhoods and all that kind of thing, or bias or a definite ethnic lean, we need to correct that. But that doesn't mean we turn into socialists. That doesn't mean that we're guaranteeing outcomes. That doesn't mean that we're, taking money out of people's bank accounts who have worked hard and accomplished a great deal, whatever their color. So as far as public policy is concerned, when people hear equity, they're thinking equality. And functionally, it makes no difference in a DC language grid.
Okay. So what I think a lot of people mix in that is that when we hear equity, we do think equality of outcome, right? Which you just said is definitely not the same thing. And that's one of the things you mentioned before, Jordan Peterson. He talks about the dangers.
I was thinking.
Yeah, in inequality of outcome. As Christians, there are so many of us that are getting our news from single sources, right? Our Facebook feeds, whether it's Twitter, Instagram, any of that stuff, all of our social media is tailored to our sort of micro niches and where we think. How, as Christians, can we appropriately respond to equity politics, and how does that line up or not line up with our Christian beliefs?
Well, I think a concern for the oppressed, a concern for the poor, and the concern for those who have endured injustice is part of the calling of Christians. You read the Hebrew prophets, especially Amos, for example, Isaiah 58. I mean, you've got a call for justice that surpasses that of Dr. King or any social activist. That doesn't move us leftward. That just means that we're meant to have the compassion of God and use our resources in a godly way to help these people. Now, especially when there's been long-term racism. Let me just do a quick little parenthesis and say, I live in a very much African-American oriented world. I think we've talked about this before. I live in DC. I go to a largely African-American church. I have half a dozen African-Americans in my family. Well, one of the reasons that a lot of African-Americans are slow to want to get vaccinated is not because they're stupid. It's not because they're hardcore right-wing libertarians. It's that there have been horrible medical experiments in America on African-Americans. They don't trust the medical community. Yeah. I'm sure you've heard of the Tuskegee medical experiment, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. Sorry. For nearly 40 years, you had doctors funded by the federal government not telling men they had syphilis so they could do experiments on them and see and research the course of syphilis. These men gave it to their wives. Babies were born with syphilis problems. It was stunning. Thank God President Clinton, a man I know wasn't largely with politically, but thank God he got up and apologized for it and engaged in a program of reparations. But that echoes in the minds of African Americans. So what I'm saying is there are systemic reasons and stories and histories that keep the certain communities from trusting. I think we as Christians need to champion them. I think we need to seek healing for them. But that's not the same thing as going Marxist. That's not the same thing as going socialist. That means that you make sure people have the basic resources, that they're cared for, that they have equal access to government, that I actually am a guy who believes we ought to have less government intrusion in our lives. But where there is government involvement, it ought to be equitable. There shouldn't be a distance between me and a black man because I'm white. And so that I do think Christians need to speak up. And quite frankly, had we spoken up earlier in our history, we wouldn't have some of the crises that we have now. So again, I'm the furthest thing from a Marxist, furthest thing from a socialist, furthest thing from a statist. But I do believe strongly in the prophetic Christian calling to ensure as best we can social justice. And I think we would have had a greater hearing for the gospel if we had been oriented that way all through the years.
I think that's a powerful statement. We would have had a greater hearing for the gospel. And what do you think it is that has prevented us from doing that or from making that kind of stand?
Well, some of it's just been outright sin. Materially comfortable, wealthy, not caring less about those less fortunate than us. You can't read the Bible. You can't get 2 pages in the Bible before you start encountering a vision for the poor, a vision for taking care of the poor. I think some of it's just been sin. Other forms of sin have just been an absolute demonic hatred of certain people. I say to my shame, because I come from, on my father's side, a family line in which there were Klansmen generations back. Nobody recently, but still, I own it. It's generations back. And one of the ways that the meetings for the Klan were called in church was when the men's softball team was convened. So men's softball team will be meeting Tuesday night at 7. It was a Klan rally. It was a Klan meeting. This is well acknowledged in a number of denominations. Well, when you've got the church engaged in that kind of violence and bigotry and hatred and murder towards a people whom God has created and made in his likeness. And by the way, if you want to get silly about it, Jesus looked more like a black man. He looked like me, or the two of you, as best I can tell through this camera. Yeah. I think we're all 3 white guys. So, it doesn't mean he loves us less. Doesn't mean Jesus loves us less. I'm just saying, if you want to talk about who looked like who, I'm the outlier. I mean, Jesus was a Middle Eastern dude from 2 millennia ago. He was as dark as a lot of the blacks in America today. Not that matters, quite frankly. We're told to love everyone. But what I'm trying to say is that there's been absolute sin. There's been a lack of understanding of biblical truth. You just can't read Amos. You can't read Isaiah 58. You can't read about the social outreach of the church in the book of Acts and not conclude that we're meant to be making a difference amongst the poor and the disenfranchised and the hurting. And that doesn't make me a leftist, as I've said. But I don't think the church has understood its biblical truth, its biblical foundation, its biblical mandate, and certainly has not understood what the early church, the medieval church, did. I mean, during the Middle Ages, I know I'm preaching here a bit, but let me rant on just for a second.
Go for it.
During the Middle Ages, the churches created orphanages. They created hospitals. Hospital was a medieval Christian invention to care for people, especially around times of plague and war and what have you. The churches created it. The churches created universities. During the period of the early church, you know, I'm sure that the idea of pater familias, a Roman father, could have a newborn baby and his family brought to him, and he could just thumbs down, and the baby would be exposed or killed. The Christians went out and collected those babies off the city walls where they were exposed. Sometimes the babies would be thrown off of bridges into rivers below. Christian deacons would be assigned to sit in boats in shifts, waiting for a baby to be thrown off the bridge. They'd go and rescue that baby and raise it in the church. Wow. So the history of our faith is one of great social outreach. And we lost that. And here's my big concluding moment on this sermon. We lost that to a large part when the church got in bed with right-wing politics. Now, I'm a conservative, and I believe in the free market, and I believe in free enterprise. But if we are hardcore right-wing, and we believe every man ought to pull himself up by his bootstraps, and we believe in the cause of the rich more we believe in the cause of the poor, even believing that being rich is evidence of God's grace and being poor is evidence of God's judgment, which some people believe, we've missed biblical truth. And that comes more from a secular conservative perspective philosophically than it comes from Scripture. So I'm a conservative. I don't mind telling you I largely vote Republican. But I also want to speak prophetically to the GOP Republicans about their lack of social mission. And that's often why I'm seen hanging out with guys on the other side of the spectrum. There are some folks who are Democrats just because they're trying to be biblical Christians, and they oppose the pro-LGBTQ, pro-abortion stance of the Democrats, but they feel like they're closer to serving the poor in the Democratic Party. I don't know that I agree, but at least I honor their attempt. And here they are trying to be biblical in a very, very divided world. So you asked me a simple question. I gave you a complicated answer, but I believe that we have missed our highest calling when it comes to reaching society, both with justice and the gospel, because we've been too right-wing and too sinful. And by the way, haven't been reading our Bibles.
Yeah, you should do a TED Talk.
Yeah, they want to talk about this stuff. That's for sure.
Yeah, certainly. Well, there's
a lot of truth in it, though.
Well, there is something to asking a simple question about a complicated issue, and I think that you gave a very robust answer for that. And when you talk about orphanages, we're out of the Dallas area. We've got a whole street in downtown Dallas. It's called Buckner, which is named after Buckner International and the orphanages and the great work that they've done there. A good friend of ours, Arnie Atkins, works with them and does stuff with Buckner, and they're still one of the biggest sources of adoption in the United States. But also, to your point, the Christian adoption agency, so much of that we've given over to the government, and we've allowed that to become government responsibility instead of something that Christians are taking responsibility for. And I don't know when that shift happened. Obviously, I think it happened before my lifetime, but with that,
because you would have put a stop to it.
Yeah, definitely. I would have been the lone voice calling out in the wilderness. I mean, I want to think that I would have been that, but I definitely don't believe that's the case. I tend to be more internally focused than outwardly focused, often to detriment. So that said, how can we reverse course now as Christians and as a church, especially when we have for so many years had such a strong political alignment? How do we get back to center almost, where we can have effective outreaches in those ways?
Well, it's going to have to happen with individual believers and the local church. I think you guys know, we talked about it before. I live in two cities, DC and Nashville. And when I was in Nashville, I don't know if you remember years ago, there was a massive flood in Nashville. Mm-hmm. Whole neighborhoods were wiped away. People were killed going to church on Sunday morning. Well, our church, very activist church, we got out in the neighborhoods and started, helping people scrape their houses or even tear their houses down, haul off the stuff. You know what our biggest problem was? Getting down the streets with all the other church vans and buses. I mean, the whole city. Now, I understand this is the buckle of the Bible Belt, Nashville, Tennessee, but I'm telling you, you didn't see, and I'm not saying the state government wasn't active. You didn't see a state government bus or car or anything. You saw the churches. You saw Samaritan's Purse. You saw First Baptist. You saw Brentwood Baptist. You saw Church of the Redeemer, man, out there in force, cooking up stuff, feeding people, tearing down things, hauling things off. I mean, they were there. We're talking about within 36 hours, the water was still at the ankle level. And so where are the homeless in your town? Where are the impoverished? Where are the battle lines ethnically? Have you sat with the angry young blacks at the university or on the streets? I'm not going at you guys. I'm talking to your audience in general. I was proud of my daughter during the days after there were some of the shootings last year of young black people She's obviously, white. Her mother's white, like we all are. But when her black friends began to feel threatened by the police in New York because there had been some illicit shootings in the country, she went out and marched with them, and they took bottles of water to the police and gave sandwiches to the police. It wasn't really an anti-police rally, but it was, hey, let's fix this. Something's gone wrong. Black people are being murdered. So my lily white daughter goes out there and marches with them. Why? I said, honey, why are you doing that? You got me a little nervous as your father. She said, because that's what Jesus would do, Dad. That's what we're meant to be doing. We're meant to be out there on the streets, calling for social justice, loving both sides, being a reconciler. And so the short answer to your question is, do the good you can do within your reach. I think sometimes we get overwhelmed with national causes, big government programs. Can we replace those? No, not at this point. Let's just start doing the good that we can do. Respect for the church will rise, and we may be entrusted with greater roles. That's certainly how it's worked in prisons. As the church has gotten into prisons, the prisons have said, please come help, please come teach, please come conduct Bible studies, please reach out to the families of the prisoners, because nobody else is doing it. That's not a federal program. It's not a state program. So if we'll do what we can do where we can do it, I think we'll begin to make a difference, and our good works will make a place for us. And I don't mean that pridefully, but that's just how it works.
I think that's an important thing for us to realize, especially as most local churches are, I think the average they say right now in post-COVID is between 50 and 60 members is the average church size. Just because, with the expanse of the pandemic and the way that it's hit everybody, it's depleted. The average church size never bumped up above 100 since the turn of the millennia. And yet, we're trying to, I think we still think so much on a large scale. So, focusing in, like you said, on those little things is going to be a big deal. Now that you've become a senior fellow at a university, senior fellow.
My IQ has shot up. I just want you to know.
No doubt.
With that title, I'm so much smarter. It's not even funny.
Just SR period plus 50.
That's right. That's right.
Plus 50 intelligence.
So one of the things that
there you go, baby.
One of the things that we're often told in a lot of what we hear especially if you're a person that's listening primarily to conservative media, is that one of the issues that we're having right now in the nation is the stuff that's being taught at the college level. The college level and the stuff at the universities is really what's pushing everybody in this direction that is anti-Christian, that is morally relative. What has your experience been at the university that you teach at, and where do you see students heading in one direction or the other?
Well, you can't speak of a university and use the word university to apply to all universities any more than you can speak of, all white people, all Christians, all anything. There are some fantastic universities teaching great content. And then you're absolutely right. The university is often, universities in America, especially tenured secular universities, are often where the crazier ideas come out in our society. There's no question about it. People tenured, I'm opposed to tenure for faculty, but tenured faculty often are unaccountable, and they, you just get all siloed in that university and up in the ivory tower, and you start putting ideas out there that are damaging and destructive. But there are some great universities in this country. I just think I'll speak to parents real quickly. I strongly believe parents need to pay more attention to where their kids go. They're going to be, for the most part, paying the bills. And, even some schools that have historic Christian reputations have moved far afield of the gospel, far afield of, what those parents are thinking it might be, and charging astronomical rates for the privilege. So I think there are some great universities. And one of the reasons I decided to, strap on with at Palm Beach Atlantic University is because they're trying to do good things. They require all the students to serve in the community their entire 4 years there. They have a strong emphasis on free enterprise. They have a strong emphasis on medicine and taking medicine to the poor. That's a lot of the reason that I got there. They have some great public policy institutes that I help with. But yeah, I decided to go with a smaller university. It's about 4,000, planning to be 8,000 by the end of the decade. And not try to get to one of these bigger universities that already kind of has set its vision for its students and doesn't do a lot in social outreach and and just kind of stayed and locked down. I wanted to go with something more younger and more activist. And there are a lot of good universities like that. So, I'll say to your audience, come join me at Palm Beach Atlantic, or find some of the great schools that are out there in the world.
Do you have room for a JR period associate fellow?
You come on, we'll find a title for you.
Sweet.
By the way, while I'm bragging about my school, it's in West Palm Beach.
Yeah, I know.
So I can throw a rock from my office to not only to Mar-a-Lago, not that it matters to me, but to the beach.
Yeah.
And that's pretty exciting. So when we're not feeding the poor and learning medicine so we can make a difference in the world and studying the free market and all that kind of stuff, we're out scuba diving and trying to spear some fish somewhere.
Soaking up the sun with Sheryl Crow.
Yeah, if I would. If they have a master's of psychology program, I'm going to start trying to talk Kirsten into moving in that direction and see if we can't get out there.
So next to Mar-a-Lago.
Are you now located in 3 places now that you got this office in Florida? Are you in Nashville, DC, and Florida now? What's going on with that?
As you know, I split my time between Nashville and DC. But 1 week a month, I'm at Palm Beach Atlantic. And I decided to do that because one of the things I wanted to do at this phase of my life was have an association with the university. Even though there are great universities in Nashville and obviously in DC, I was looking for something special. And I think Palm Beach Atlantic is special. I'm very pleased with what they want me to do and what I am doing and how they're functioning and the kind of students they're raising up. And I'm just very pleased. They're very pleased. They're thoughtful. They've got leadership programs, ministry programs, all kinds of things, medicine, psychology, education. But a lot of it's about service. Again, every student, think about this. Every student has to do what they call a workship. They obviously altered the word worship, but worshiping through workship program the entire time they're on campus. And that ends up being worth hundreds of millions of dollars in the local community in terms of its impact. And I don't mean necessarily to business, but in terms of social impact and making a difference in the lives of the underprivileged. And that just makes me really happy. So I decided to buy in there.
That makes a lot of sense with the whole walk your talk kind of a thing, which you seem to be to be pretty good at. We've really enjoyed getting to listen to not just the Stephen Mansfield podcast, if our listeners haven't checked that out, but also the GreatMan podcast, where you do a lot to challenge men. Every now and then the 2 podcasts will sync up, but typically they're very different in the way that the GreatMan podcast seems to be targeted not just at men to get something for them, like so many podcasts are now doing. They're trying to get a male audience. You are actually challenging men to take the next step, to be better fathers, to be better husbands, to be better leaders in their church. What is the GreatMan podcast and the work that you're doing there? What is its translation on or in the university level with the work that you're doing at Palm Beach Atlantic?
Well, I appreciate you asking that. The GreatMan podcast, everything I do for men is under the moniker GreatMan. I have an organization called GreatMan and GreatMan Global. And what we're basically doing is calling the greatness out of men. Calling it out, telling them they're great, telling them they got special gifts they ought to be using for social good, telling them that God's made them for certain things. Not better than women. I'm tired of everybody portraying the relationship between men and women socially as some kind of tug of war, as some kind of battle for a pie that's only a certain size. It ought to be a mutual encouragement society. We ought to be helping women. I've got a daughter, as I've said to you before, who's about 31, 32. I want her to be everything. I want her to be the general, the pope, the president, the queen, everything she can possibly be in life. And I think that good men want that too. And good men want to create an environment in which women ascend. So there's a lot of connection between this work and what I do at Palm Beach Atlantic. One of the things GreatMan wants to accomplish is to start a minor, an academic minor. You have your major, your minor, and your bachelor's degree, but start a minor in men's studies, and one that's online so other schools can pick it up and use it as their minor. There are lots of women's studies programs. I think that's great. Women have certain biological needs and certain history and certain, cultural challenges. I think it's fine to study those, but there ought to be one for men. Men are absolutely, statistically speaking, they are in free fall. From their earnings to their health to their all kinds of things. Men are in free fall and boys are following them. And so there's a real crisis happening here. And I'd like to make people in every kind of profession who are leaders of men and who understand men and have insight into men. So male psychology and male biology and male cultural needs and, all of that kind of thing. So that's one of the things that I'm doing. They're asking me to help lead a men's movement on campus, a movement that would in turn have an impact beyond the campus. And one of the things I'm excited about with Palm Beach Atlantic University is that we're right there in West Palm Beach, and a lot of the New York financial houses are moving down into that area. So again, I can throw a rock from my office to Goldman Sachs, which has moved to Palm Beach. So a lot of those big New York financial houses are fed up with New York. They're now down there. Well, I'm going to get them involved with young men. I'm going to get them involved with Manhood. I'm going to get them funding things and opening their companies to things and having programs. And again, it's not anti-woman in any way, for heaven's sakes. You'd have to know my daughter, my wife, to know that I'm all about leading women. But I'm saying men are in trouble. And so we've got to do what we can do. And I'm thrilled to have a role that allows me to do that.
I think that's one of the coolest things that I've gotten to share with the young men in my church is not just your podcast and the stuff that you're doing with the GreatMan movement, but Mansfield's book of Manly Men has been, I mean, you saw the first time we had you on, we got a stack of Stephen Mansfield books because starting with that one, you've become one of the favorite authors of a lot of the men in our church because you speak to men in a way that is very lateral. You don't talk down to men for not being something or telling them that they should be something. There's no victimization in anything that you're talking about. You talk a lot about the principles that make up a good man. Why do you think that men, especially within Christianity or men that are on the conservative path, let's say, or of the conservative bend, why do you think that we get so caught up in fighting for things that don't matter? I think that's probably the best way for me to put it. I know that's a bit of a vague question, but I think you know where I'm heading with that. Why do you think we get so caught up with fighting things that don't matter? For instance, we get caught up in fighting about things like, let's say, equity politics, right? And fighting the semantics of what a word does or doesn't mean. Or you see a lot of people that are now trumpeting the January 6th stuff and trying to fight the semantics of what it was and what it wasn't, instead of being centrally focused on the gospel, centrally focused on what are the things that I can do for my community, the things that I can do for my family, the things that I can do for my church. Why are we being so drawn off sides by these larger political issues instead of being focused on what, tending our field, let's say?
Well, if your question is about Christians and why they get pulled off those things, I want to suggest that it's because we have been taught and we have believed and we've attempted to lead a weak gospel. Mm. If you believe that being a Christian is believing in Jesus and waiting until the rapture so we can escape all this crap and go to heaven, then you are not only going to live a missionless life, you're not only going to have an emptiness on the inside of you, you're going to make no difference in the society. And so I would suggest that we've had a very weak gospel proclaimed that didn't engage men. It's why most churches are filled with women and not men. Men went and they didn't find mission. They didn't find purpose. They didn't find bands of brothers. They didn't find changing the world. And so they thought, well, I can just wait for the rapture without going to church. I believe in Jesus. I'm saved. If that's all there is, avoiding hell, let me go back to the golf course. And that's why some of the churches I most admire and churches that are really thriving in our society are churches that have dynamic men's movements in them, largely led from the pulpit by the pastor. And they're about changing the world. Let's go father the unfathered boys in our community. Let's go build some stuff overseas. Let's get people, going. And let's make a difference in our society. Let's be great men. At the same time, let's teach men character and holiness and fathering and husbanding and being who they're meant to be. But let's be men from the guts out to the glory of God. And I'll tell you what, those churches explode because, the statistic probably you get a child involved in a church, about a 4% chance you're going to get the family involved. You get a wife involved in a church, about 17% chance you're going to get the family involved. But you get the husband or the father involved in the church, there's a 92% you're going to get the entire family in that church. Wow. So when these men lose their hearts to mission and purpose and social outreach and living a beefy gospel, well, they bring their whole families and their brother and their bands of friends from whatever, the construction company and the bar and the softball team, and the thing explodes. I'm talking about churches of thousands and thousands and thousands of people in this country, largely built I'm not saying the women are neglected. The women are thrilled because you get a church full of noble men. Women are, they are loved and taken care of and protected and thrive. But I could actually name some of these churches. It's unbelievable what's happening with them. And again, I think we've had a weak gospel and men weren't engaged by it. And that's been a lot of the plague of our church.
What would you say to those? Now, I don't know if you've been keeping up with this particular podcast. Christianity Today came out with a podcast called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. Have you listened to any episodes of that, or are you familiar with it?
I just downloaded it. It's my next thing. It's amazing that you mentioned it, but I'm looking forward to hearing it.
Okay, so it's a 12-part series, and I don't, if you know a little bit about the story, it's about the Mars Hill up in Seattle, Washington that Mark Driscoll led. And one of the things that the podcast posits is that too many churches that are focused on men's ministry are breeding grounds for toxic masculinity, right? How do we as a church, or how do we as individuals, how do we strike that difference or that, balance between over masculinizing things to the place where it is harmful versus what a good or what a great man is and can be?
Yeah, I should start by saying that I believe there is a thing called toxic masculinity. And I love the image that it comes down through history. The Latin word, our word toxic comes from the Latin word toxicum, which used to refer to in the ancient world the poison that arrows were dipped in. So, you could fire an arrow into a guy and do a bloody wound, but then you could fire a poison-tipped arrow into a guy and he would die immediately of the poison. And so when I tell men, there is a thing called toxic masculinity, and it's when you use your gifts, your words, your physical strength, all of that you have in the service of damaging people. You're firing poisoned arrows into your child, into your wife, into your society, into your own soul. And I do believe that. So as men discover their gifts, they discover their strengths, they start to realize what they're made to be. If they aren't taught the moral code for that, if they aren't taught God's will for that, they'll just start firing arrows into people. And that's, I think, what some people have done. Apparently, that's the allegation against the topic of this podcast you're mentioning, that he recognized what his gifts were, knew what he was as a man, but he got all bold and arrogant about it and began to harm people. Now, I don't have any way of knowing if what's claimed is true. I didn't know him. But I will say for sure that when we teach men, quote unquote, their power, we've also got to teach them their responsibilities, their obligations, the constraints on that power, the way that power is meant to be used. I have power to my words, not so I can destroy my children, destroy my wife, but so I can build them up, so I can call out destiny, so I encourage them, so I can exercise spiritual authority, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so is toxic masculinity a thing? And is it possible even for Christian men? Absolutely. That's any man who's told his wife to submit and wants her to be barefoot pregnant in the kitchen is engaging in a form of toxic masculinity. We've got to be beyond that, be more biblical and be more consistent with God's word and God's spirit and how we use the power that he's given us.
Well, what if it was make a sandwich in a joking manner? Is that still toxic?
Probably the way you did it when she got mad at you, yes.
There you
Probably
go.
It was.
There we go. Thank you. Thank you very much. Truth
be told, that was a joke. I actually do most of the cooking in our house because I enjoy feeding people. That's something I get pleasure out of.
Well, Dr. Mansfield, we do appreciate your time. We end all of our
I make
interviews
better sandwiches than my wife
with a segment named for you, actually, called Controlled Rowdiness. Now, these are just a set of some rapid fire questions. Your answer can be as short or as long as you'd like it to be. There are no right answers, but there are several wrong ones. And Danley, if you will, take us away.
Okay. Last time, we posited a theory or a theoretical situation.
Yes, hypothetical.
Hypothetical. That's the thing.
There you go.
Aliens have arrived and they want a story, or they're going to destroy Earth. You told the story of Jesus, and survived. They are back for round 2, for season 2. So we need another story that's not the story of Jesus. You have 60 seconds to tell them a story so awesome that they don't destroy Earth.
Go. Oh my gosh. You're throwing me a curve here. So awesome that
48 seconds.
I'm not gonna hit this. I'm so sorry.
How about David and Jonathan? Anything
Oh,
cool
I love
there?
David and Jonathan. Yes, yes, yes. There's a king. There's a king. He's evil. He's demonized. He wants to kill a young warrior who has shown himself worthy. The king's son, though, steps in the king's way, protects the young warrior, and eventually tells the young warrior that he will be king and not the king's son who is protecting him. And so one of the greatest dynasties in the history of the world is created because a king's son surrenders his rights and protects a young shepherd boy who's become a great warrior from his own father. And I would tell it better to Martians, but nevertheless, that's my story.
That was it.
They loved it.
That was right at world saved. World saved. So we've talked a lot about some political stuff, and I'm just curious. One of the things you've mentioned before is that the American system is protected from this kind of sort of takeover of one party or the other by midterm elections. Are you seeing a shift towards conservatism in the midterms that are coming up here in 2022?
Yes, I think there'll be a strong shift towards conservatism, and it's largely because leftist ideas posited by the Biden administration have not worked. Defund the police, which Biden made a head fake towards. More open borders, just a disaster on our southern borders, et cetera, et cetera. So these things have not worked. Biden has shown himself incredibly weak. And then again, I say Afghanistan, Afghanistan, Afghanistan. And so I think you're going to see a conservative surge, which means that the Democrats will lose the House and could lose an evenness in the Senate.
Who's got a better poker face? Brian Stelter or Jen Psaki?
Psaki.
Yeah, I think so too.
No question.
Yeah, there's no question there, actually.
No. Yeah, no, none at all. So you've written several books about United States presidents. We got Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Barack Obama, George W. Bush. If you could write about one other president, who would it be?
I would, if there weren't already some great books on him, I would really enjoy doing Reagan. I think the Reagan story is really amazing. I don't think enough justice has been done to him, to his rise. Reagan had a father who was a drunk, who used to come home and fall splat on the front porch, humiliated his son. I could just go on and on. Reagan failed as an actor, had horrible confrontations with the communists in Hollywood, et cetera. I think we tend to like kind of like Churchill. We tend to like the speeches. We tend to like the humor. We tend to like the good looks. We like the fact that he led us out of some darkness in our history. But I tend to like looking at the personal suffering of a person who eventually becomes a great leader, because that encourages me that all of us can aspire to greatness in our own lives, no matter what opposition we have. And Reagan had horrible opposition, divorced, and had children who hated him and all that kind of thing. And still one of our greatest presidents, maybe our greatest.
I think
and loved jelly beans, right?
I think it's interesting he said that Winston Churchill was handsome.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. Do you think he was classically handsome?
No, not classically. Reagan was handsome.
Okay.
But, Reagan, I think I was trying to say the humor. They shared the humor.
Right.
Churchill was not exactly a model.
But what do you think the spirit animal of Winston Churchill is?
Bulldog. It's got to be. Come on.
Bulldog. Yeah, for sure.
Got to be.
All right. And last question. If you could do one thing to fix the Dallas Cowboys, what would you do?
Lord have mercy. I think I'd change owners.
Yeah.
I'd change owners.
It's the same answer that everyone gives.
Yeah. Jerry the owner should fire Jerry the general manager. That would fix everything. Yeah, maybe so.
And raise up the dang jumbotron that's so low that
they hit it.
I absolutely agree.
I mean,
good grief. Oh, Stephen, thanks again for coming on the show. Tell our listeners where it is that they can find you, follow you, support your stuff.
Yeah, StephenMansfield.tv is my website. All my social media is Mansfield Writes, WRITES at the end of Mansfield. And then, of course, you want to check out GreatMan.tv and the GreatMan podcast if you're a man and want to join us in the journey of being great men.
Well, we will have links to all of that stuff in the show notes, as well as our Stephen Mansfield book of the interview, which is God and Guinness, which is one of my favorites, mostly because it's got a yellow cover. That's what initially attracted my eye to it. But
Oh yeah, you love yellow.
I got a thing for yellow. But I grabbed it off of a shelf at the church that I worked at in Canada, and that is what started my my literary love affair with Stephen Mansfield. Well,
you're very kind. You're very kind. Thank you.
Thanks again for being on the show, man. Hope you have a great day.
Great to be with you. Bye-bye.
Stephen freaking Mansfield. Now, if you guys don't know, Stephen Mansfield did tell us that he loved us whenever he was signing off. That was pretty exciting. So,
I mean, I don't have anything to say.
I do think the stuff he was saying, he's very diplomatic about the way that he presents politics, which I appreciate so much. I appreciate so much.
Which is a dumb thing to say, but it's true. It's the same. I meant that when I said that he's the Jordan Peterson of the
United States.
The United States.
Yeah.
He sums things up in a way that I go, yeah. I couldn't have said it better. I couldn't have gotten close to saying it as eloquently as he did. But he sums up a lot of big problems in a way that I think he's right.
Yeah, and he's got a way of making divisive language make sense.
Mm-hmm.
You know, with talking about the difference between equity and equality, which are some of the terms that we're hearing so much, like this word doesn't really mean what you think it means, and this is how we should respond to it. How Christians can be involved in social justice in a way that's productive, that is meaningful for the gospel, and that is edifying for our community in a way that glorifies God is an important thing. And I really just appreciate how much he can start to say something that I immediately want to be like, oh, you used one of the buzzwords that I know that I disagree with. And then by the time he gets to the end, I'm like, oh, you know what? You're right. There are some things that we need to do in order to get better and to fix some stuff. It's very powerful the way that he does that.
And I think he's right about the reason that men have avoided church.
Oh, yeah.
And then the last, I don't know how long. Yeah.
Well, and it kind of piggybacks off of...
I did.
Well, and it piggybacks off a little bit of the interview we did with J. Warner Wallace, right? Is that church is something that for so long has been geared towards women. That the emotional songs and all of that stuff, and there was never a reason for guys to go.
For years, man, I would go to different churches, and there's ones that I went to that I enjoyed, like Matt Chandler is one.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed hearing him speak, and this is not a negative against his church, but
sure.
I generally couldn't wait to get out of there because I didn't have a band of brothers or a mission or something that I was doing. And I know that that's something that churches are always trying to do is get their people involved. And
right.
But he's right.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things that we've seen,
we need to do something.
Well, and like
we need to have a little bit of trouble and go take care of people, but joke around along the way. And you know, he's mentioned controlled rowdiness, which is where we get our segment from,
right?
Which is a great way of saying it, that we need that. I need that.
Yeah, and it's one of those things I think over the course of our interviews with him that has really helped to build a bit of a rapport. Because the very first time we interviewed him, we were so nervous.
Yeah,
it was like the first big interview that we'd really done. And as soon as
suited up, just like Barney taught us.
Yeah, and after he answered the first question, we're just like, oh crap.
Yeah.
We that was it. He answered our question and our follow-up questions all within his thing. And he was definitely our intellectual superior. While that has continued to remain the case, one of the things I think has been fun in building a relationship is that kind of sparring back and forth in controlled rowdiness. And, you coming off with your non sequiturs, like, telling Heather to make a sandwich, whether or not that's toxic masculinity, which I thought was one of the better parts of the episode. Stephen, thanks again for coming on. Make sure that you check out all of the stuff in the show notes about how you can get in touch with Stephen at Mansfield Writes, as well as Stephen, Stephen, Mansfield.
Like and subscribe.
Yeah.
Haven't already.
Do all of that stuff. Thanks for checking out the show. You guys have good give, and we'll see you next week.
Hi there. My name is Stephen Mansfield. I'm an author, and I'm also Senior Fellow of Public Leadership at Palm Beach Atlantic University. And here's why you should never listen to the Reverend and the Reprobate, because they are nuts. They are crazy, and they will infect you with the germs of their thinking. Run now.